at the very core, the very foundation of the identity politics, the leftism, is the desire to fundamentally change Western civilization. But the only way they can successfully change the root, the core, and the very institutions of Western civilization is to galvanize the public into doing so by voting. The only way they can do that is by demonizing and placing the failures and the West as an effigy, and to place their achievements, their inventions, their explorations, medicine, and all the good things they did on the back burner. That is why they are demonizing Christopher Columbus, Christianity, white people, and everything else in general. The ends justify the means. One of the ways they're doing this is with slavery. Slavery has lasted for thousands of years. The Roman Empire had slaves. If you look at the entire institution of slavery, America only had slaves for 245 years. The last time anyone was a slave in the United States was 148 years ago. And the only reason that happened was because of the bloodiest war in American history. Not only was it the bloodiest war in American history, but it was the bloodiest war in the Western Hemisphere. It cost 620,000 lives, which is more deaths than the entire slave estimated population in the United States at its peak, which was estimated at 600,000 slaves. So why so much more concern for dead people who are now beyond our help than for living human beings, suffering the burdens and humiliations of slavery today? Why does a verbal picture of the abuses of slaves in centuries past arouse far more response than contemporary photographs of present-day slaves? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, slavery still exists today. But people are more angry about slavery 148 years ago, when you have 167 countries that still have slaves. 46 million people are slaves today, it is estimated. Since 167 is quite an astronomical number, I will simply give you the 6 worst offenders. Number 1 is India, 18.4 million slaves. China, 3.4 million. Pakistan, 2.1 million. Bangladesh, 1.5 million. Uzbekistan, 1.2 million. And North Korea, 1.1 million. Here's the thing, though. These are not your traditional antebellum slaves working on plantations. You have sex slaves. You have individuals who are forced into marriage as slaves. All different types of slaves. But the media never focuses on that. But as a white man who is 26 years old, never owned a slave, my family never owned slaves, I'm supposed to feel guilty about something that neither I nor my family was ever responsible for. So the first question you got to ask yourself is, where did the word slave come from? The word slave actually came from the word for Slav, because during the Middle Ages, Slavs were so widely used as slaves in both Europe and the Islamic world. It derived from the word Slav not only in the English language, but also in other European languages as well as Arabic. I would love to ask your prototypical social justice warrior, where did the word slavery originate? And then when you bring up it's for Slav, and you also bring up that in other translations it is the same way, you will see the total shock and despair on their face. Because only white people are racist. Only white people are bad. But here's the thing, though. Slavery and racism aren't interconnected. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. And indigenous people enslaved other indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere long before Columbus's ships appeared on the horizon. Only relatively late in history did enslavement cross racial lines. To make racism the driving force behind slavery is to make a historically recent factor the cause of an institution which originated thousands of years earlier. Now we hear often about slavery, about what the individual slaves had to suffer through, which I have read extensively. I am by no means justifying slavery. It was terrible. It is the worst thing the U.S. has ever done. There's no excuse for it. It's pathetic. It's disgusting. It is awful. But it's like we only hear about it in the U.S. We only hear about it in terms of white people enslaving Africans, when the institution has been around far longer, still is going on today. And even Europeans were enslaved. You hear extensively about slavery. Frederick Douglass, Uncle Tom's Cabin, all of these books which document in detail in huge volumes. I've read some of them. Slavery. But you never read what ended slavery. Notice, you never hear about what ended slavery other than the Civil War in the United States. So the question is, what ended slavery? The anti-slavery ideology began to develop in the 18th century Britain, at a time when the British Empire led the world in slave trading and when the economy of most of its overseas colonies in the Western Hemisphere depended on slaves. While slavery was common to all civilizations, only one civilization rose against it. So while Europeans were the leading slave traders of the 18th century, they nevertheless, in the 19th century, became the destroyers of slavery around the world, not just in European societies, but also in the non-Western societies, despite strong opposition. Slavery did not die out quietly, of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end, and it lost only because Europeans had gunpowder first. I mentioned this in another video, but one of the reasons the West became very powerful is because of their proximity to one another and the constant warfare. They were at war with one another, seems like every week. When you have wars, you advance your weaponry, so gunpowder. You create ships that are smaller, that are more elusive, quicker, that are better at warfare. You also have bigger budgets because you have to pay for those military occupations. Therefore, you have more gold and resources to spend that gold on. And you have more exploration. But because that the West was the most powerful, and because they opposed slavery, they were able to offer the stipulations to the rest of the world. The British Empire stamped out slavery not only throughout the British Empire, and I'll get into that later, what they did specifically, But the British Empire, it included 1/4 of the world, whether you measure that in geographic area or individual citizens. But they also ended it in other nations. If you have a social justice warrior friend, these people have short attention spans. They regurgitate everything they hear on the media. So just simply ask them, have you heard of the Aberdeen Act of 1845? If they say no, tell them to look it up. Don't complain, don't argue. The very first thing you should say is when they start talking about reparations, have you heard of the Aberdeen Act of 1845? Now, this was an act of Parliament of the United Kingdom to abolish slavery in Brazil. The act gave the Royal Navy authority to stop and search any Brazilian ship suspected of being a slave ship on the high seas and to arrest slave traders caught on these ships. The act stipulated that arrested slave traders could be tried in British courts. The law was designed to suppress the Brazilian slave trade and end the Atlantic slave trade by enforcing Brazilian laws and international treaties that Brazil had signed since the 1820s, but never enforced. As a result, the Royal Navy began intercepting Brazilian slave ships on the high seas, and Brazilian slave traders caught on those ships were prosecuted in British Admiralty courts. Over the following years, the number of cases in British Admiralty courts increased dramatically due to the large number of Brazilians arrested for slave trading. In the first 6 months of 1848, 19 out of 33 cases heard by the Vice Admiralty Court were Brazilian. What really ended slavery in Brazil was the pressure from the British. Because one of the things the British did is they were very nationalistic. They created tariffs, the government legislative tariffs on sugar. And since the Brazilians wanted to compete under the guise of the competition, they started importing slaves despite the pressure from the British. So in 1850 to 1851, a handful of British ships began entering Brazilian territorial waters, and even its harbors to attack slave ships. In one instance, a British ship exchanged fire with a Brazilian fort. In the face of these tensions, Brazil knew that it could not afford to go to war with Britain. I mean, they were the most powerful navy during that time anyway. In September 1850, new legislation outlawing the slave trade was enacted, and the Brazilian government began to enforce it. As a result, the Brazilian slave trade declined, and the trade came to an end in the mid-1850s, although slavery was not officially abolished in Brazil until 1888. Also, the British government pressured the Ottoman Empire into banning the African slave trade and later threatened to start boarding Ottoman ships in the Mediterranean if the empire did not do a better job of policing the ban. Still later, Americans stamped out slavery in the Philippines, the Dutch stamped it out in Indonesia, the Russians in Central Asia, the French in their West African and Caribbean colonies, Germans in their East Africa colonies often hanged slave traders on the spot when they were caught in the act. No non-Western nation or civilization shared this opposition to slavery that began to develop in the Western world in the late 18th century, reached its peak in the 19th century, and continued to fuel the anti-slavery efforts that were still necessary in much of Africa and the Middle East, and on to the first half of the 20th century. So these evil white people were the reason that Brazil, the Ottoman Empire, parts of Africa, the Philippines, parts of China, and other specific colonies not in the Western Hemisphere ended slavery. But the mainstream narrative is that white people owe reparations. I would say their blood in the Civil War and their blood fighting the Ottomans, fighting the Brazilians, is enough.